on Auschwitz. The history of Auschwitz is exceptionally complex. It combined two functions, a concentration camp and extermination center. Nazi Germany persecuted various groups of people there, and the camp complex was continually expanded and transformed. In the podcast on Auschwitz, we discuss the details of the history of the camp, as well as our contemporary memory of this important and special place. Over the nearly 5 years of the operation of the Auschwitz camp, around 8.2 thousand SS men and 200 SS female overseers served there. Dr. Agnieszka Kita, deputy head of the Auschwitz Museum Archive, talks about what their leisure time looked like, what they did after duty when they returned to the barracks, and what their days off looked like.
Who was responsible for organizing leisure time for the SS Garrison in KL Auschwitz?
Kto był odpowiedzialny za rozrywkę SS-manów w obozie, to zmieniało się w czasie trwania obozu.
Who was responsible for the entertainment of SS men in the camp changed over the course of the camp's existence. At the beginning, from the establishment of Auschwitz, that is, from 1940, it was the garrison sergeant major of the commandant's office who dealt not only with organizing leisure time in the form of cultural or sporting events or social evenings, the so-called Kameradschaftsabende, but also initially his duties included ideological training for SS men. Over time, however, Department 6 of the camp was officially established to deal essentially with social welfare and ideological training for the garrison. The first mention of this department in the orders of the Commandant's office, which are highly important documents informing us about the life and work of the Auschwitz garrison, appears on October 17, 1941, when we are given information about who headed it, where its office was located, and so on. We can therefore assume that Department 6 began functioning in Auschwitz in October 1941. Especially since in September of that same year, Oberscharführer Kurt Knittel was transferred from Sachsenhausen to the Auschwitz camp. He was assigned the task of providing the SS men with so-called social welfare, as well as ideological training, and thus was named head of Department 6. The fact that Department 6 was not so crucial to the functioning of the camp may be indicated by Knittel's own rank, because he was not an officer. In fact, Oberscharführer was a rank he received only in Auschwitz, and it corresponds to staff sergeant in the army, whereas the heads of other departments were typically officers, at least with the rank of Untersturmführer, that is, second lieutenant. As for Kurt Knittel's duties, he also discussed them during the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials. He was questioned there as a witness and recalled his arrival in Auschwitz and what his work there involved. However, during the trial, he focused more on the ideological aspects of his training duties. Today we will examine the more off-duty activities of Department 6, namely the organization of leisure time and the social welfare intended for the SS men. As I mentioned, the first reference appears in October, specifically on October 17, 1941. It provides information about who was appointed head of Department 6 and where its office was located. It was situated on the upper floor of the Stabsgebäude, and that was where one could go to meet with Kurt Knittel, who was of course assigned several other SS men to assist him in his work. In October 1941, Knittel also took command of the camp library, which is mentioned in the Commandant's office orders as well. For example, an entry from September 17, 1941, specifies when books could be borrowed and returned, on Fridays, between 8 and 9 p.m. We also find information about the personnel responsible for running the library. Interestingly, throughout the operation of this KL Auschwitz Garrison Library, records show that SS men had to be penalized for keeping books past their due dates. Knittel often complained to the commandant that books were not being returned on time, which eventually forced them to go so far as to restrict borrowing privileges for those who failed to return items on schedule. but I will discuss these matters further in a moment. So, to sum up, who was responsible for organizing the leisure time of the SS men? First, it was the Garrison Sergeant Major, the Stabscharführer of the Commandant's office. Then Kurt Knittel, and of course the SS men themselves, who also came up with various activities during their hours off. Later, I will talk about the official events arranged by Department 6, as well as the less official, more personal ways of spending free time that the SS men chose for themselves.
Na spędzanie czasu wolnego, które organizowali sobie sami SS-mani.
What sources regarding their off-duty time have survived, and what can we learn from them?
Tych źródeł zachowało się z jednej strony na tyle dużo, że jesteśmy w stanie...
On one hand, enough of these sources have been preserved for us to imagine how these people spent their leisure time here at Auschwitz. On the other hand, they are not sufficient to determine this precisely. I will explain exactly what I mean in a moment. Before that, however, I would like to make a comment about the Auschwitz SS garrison itself. For people who are not researchers and do not deal with this topic on a daily basis, which is perfectly natural, it might seem strange that these men did anything in the camp other than mistreating prisoners or conducting selections on the ramp. On the other hand, we must realize that their service, in principle and by its very nature, did not differ all that much from regular garrison duty. What do I mean by that? We essentially have two types of SS men here, those from the guard companies and those from the commandant's office staff, meaning those who had a real impact on the operation of the camp. Now, the SS men who were quartered in the barracks were subject to the rules of garrison life. So they had set hours for duty and leisure. They could apply for passes, leaves, and so on. By contrast, those employed within the commandant's office staff, especially the ones in Department 3, responsible for the organization of the camp, or in administration, had more regulated working hours, so their free time and how it was organized looked quite different. My point is that we should realize, however it may sound, that they had a life outside the camp. All of them had a life outside the camp. They spent their free time in various ways, either in an official capacity arranged by the Commandant's office or Department 6, or entirely as they pleased, for instance, with their families or during vacation leaves. We must also keep in mind that it should not surprise us that these people had leisure time, that it was well organized, and that, in a sense, it was intended to offer an escape from their work. Their lives did not revolve solely around the camp and the prisoners, and things were also happening beyond the barbed wire. Returning, however, to the documents I mentioned, these are primarily the Commandant's office and garrison orders, records that tell us how the SS men from the KL Auschwitz garrison served and lived. They contain a wealth of information about various cultural and sporting events, as well as social evenings. These were officially arranged, controlled forms of entertainment, and there were quite a lot of them in the camp. We can infer this by examining the Commandant's office orders, a vast number of which have survived. They are organized chronologically, making it truly possible to reconstruct the history of the camp and how the SS garrison functioned in Auschwitz. Next are the SS personnel files. These include items like leave slips, travel passes, and sports diplomas, along with records of sports decorations or disciplinary actions. The latter give us insight into the unauthorized ways the SS men spent their leisure hours, or what behavior was not tolerated by their superiors. We also have lists of free Sundays, so we know that not every Sunday was a day off for everyone. There was a set roster for this practice within the camp. Finally, we have the SS sports booklets, which document the disciplines they practiced and who played what. Naturally, not all of them were preserved, but we have a dozen or so representative examples. Then, of course, there are memoirs and statements by both prisoners and SS men, who describe what life in the camp looked like, not only their official duties, but also their private, off-duty lives. We have photographs as well, such as the famous Karl Höcke album, which depicts many group outings, like the trip to Zollehütte in Między Brodje, a mountain retreat intended for the Auschwitz SS garrison. It features various hunting excursions, formal dinners, and even a tour of a coal mine. So photography can also provide a great deal of information about their leisure time, as well as holidays and celebrations like Julefest, the winter solstice festival. Therefore, in addition to text documents, we have visual records too. We may not be able to reconstruct how this free time looked in its entirety, but we have plenty of examples that allow us to paint a fairly decent sketch of what happened here during those hours off. Most of these records are held in our archive. Of course, one can use other documents, such as those found in the Bundesarchiv, or at other memorial sites. As we know, concentration camps were modeled after Dachau, and their organization was fundamentally similar, though slight adaptations to local conditions certainly existed. For instance, while the SS men from Auschwitz traveled to Poromka and Międzyrbrodzie, those from Dachau sometimes went to northern Italy. So there are differences when it comes to trips. Nevertheless, these records do indeed give us insight into their lives outside of service.
Także te dokumenty rzeczywiście dają nam wgląd w ich życie poza służbą.
Could you tell us a little more about what the SS men did in their free time?
Tak jak wspomniałam, możemy powiedzieć o takich rozrywkach czasu wolnego odgórnie organizowanych i takich indywidualnych.
As I mentioned, we can divide these leisure activities into those officially organized and individual ones that came from the initiative of the Garrison members themselves. As for the official activities, let us start with those organized by Department 6. Much depended on the creativity and commitment of the head of this department. Within the boundaries set by National Socialist ideology, he actually had quite considerable latitude in organizing such events. From the documents, we know that at the beginning of his work, after arriving in Auschwitz, Kurt Knittel ordered a lot of equipment for the camp, such as a movie projector, a jukebox, numerous records, songbooks, and various maps. The maps were needed for sightseeing trips, but also for ideologically oriented classes and training. We also know that they ordered a range of board games, playing cards, and ping-pong tables. There are orders for a large number of musical instruments, including harmonicas, as well as more advanced instruments for the SS orchestra, which was supposed to play during social evenings. As we can see, Knittel put real effort into organizing the cultural life at a fairly decent level. Theater groups, singers, actors, and operetta performers frequently came to Auschwitz. While this might not have been what we would call high culture, an earnest attempt was made to provide variety for the garrison. In 1942, for example, such performances or recitals took place as often as 2 or 3 times a month. The performers were by no means random amateurs. They were professional actors from theaters in places like Berlin, Dresden, and Breslau. In one book, I came across the memoirs of an actor who had visited Auschwitz and described performing for the SS men. Unfortunately, I have not been able to confirm this in the orders of the Commandant's office, although he gives a rough time frame. It is possible he simply was not listed by name, as performers were usually identified individually in those records. Nevertheless, this account appears in Richard Grunberger's A Social History of the Third Reich. While it certainly requires further verification, the fact remains that an actor recalls his time at Auschwitz. Thus, these cultural, theatrical, and operetta events were quite popular. Their popularity and frequency declined in 1944. At that point, as we can also infer from the Commandant's office and garrison orders, a much greater emphasis was placed on ideological training. The situation at the front and the general wartime circumstances provide a clear picture of why this was happening. Generally speaking, by analyzing the Commandant's office orders, one could even create a cultural calendar of what took place in the camp and when. In addition to on-site performances, the SS men also had the opportunity to go to the theater, for instance, in Katowice. This was particularly true before Department 6 was established in Auschwitz. And that caused certain problems, because the SS men would very often collect their tickets, but simply not show up for the performance, choosing instead to enjoy a night off in Katowice in their own way. This became such a widespread issue that the commandant eventually declared that they would only receive a voucher to be exchanged at the theater box office in Katowice. Anyone who failed to appear for the performance would lose the privilege of participating in such outings in the future. So as we can see, what was supposed to be an officially arranged trip could easily be used to spend time in Katowice in a completely different way than attending a play. Nevertheless, the opportunity was there. Later on, theater troupes traveled to Auschwitz more frequently. In addition to theatrical events, going to the movies was also an option. There were various locations in Auschwitz that the SS men could visit, but policies regarding them changed over time. Depending on whether Auschwitz had already been cleared of Jews, or whether there was still a risk of encountering Polish or Jewish residents, certain local establishments and cultural venues were either accessible to the SS personnel or restricted. Nevertheless, going to the cinema remained a popular pastime. Film screenings also took place in the camp itself, which explains why Knittel ordered the movie projector. These included both propaganda and entertainment films, though drawing a clear line between the two in the Third Reich is quite difficult. Apart from overtly propagandistic films like Achtung, der Feind hört mit, Beware, the enemy is listening, they could watch much lighter movies, such as the romantic comedies that were popular at the time and approved by the Reich Ministry of Propaganda. So these films were shown both in local movie theaters and presumably within the camp as well. Sporting events were another officially arranged type of activity. The so-called SS Sportgemeinschaft, the Auschwitz SS Sports Association, was established in early July 1941 by Commandant Rudolf Höss, while Untersturmführer Richard Baer assumed an honorary officer patronage over it. The actual expert responsible for its coordination was an avid sportsman, Unterscharführer Wilhelm Clausen, who was well known even among the prisoners for his enthusiasm for sports. Clausen worked in the political department and later served for some time as a Rapportführer in the main camp, so the prisoners knew him quite well and were aware that his true passion was athletics, to which he devoted every free moment. We know this from statements and memoirs of prisoners, as well as from Clausen himself, who was also questioned during the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial. What sports could they practice? Above all, soccer, handball, athletics, swimming, tennis, and skiing, cross-country skiing in particular. The Sports Association offered its members insurance, equipment rentals, and even swimming lessons, making the overall selection quite extensive. This is hardly surprising, given that sports were incredibly important in the Third Reich, especially within the SS, and served not only as entertainment, but also propaganda purposes. Consequently, SS men were strongly encouraged to practice sports and earn various sports and proficiency badges. In Auschwitz, preparatory courses were even organized to help candidates qualify for these decorations awarded in the Third Reich, and our extensive records of track and field and soccer practices allow us to reconstruct this highly developed athletic aspect of garrison life in considerable detail. What is more, we can even identify some of the better-known SS athletes at Auschwitz. Aside from Wilhelm Clausen, these included Unterscharführer Herbert Winter and a man named Achterlich, both of whom were key figures in the garrison sports activities. Commendations for them often appear in the orders of the commandant's office after they won or placed well in competitions. At some point, Winter took over the leadership of the Sports Association from Clausen and ran it until the end of the war. In their personnel files, we can also find congratulatory diplomas detailing their athletic successes, signed by Clausen, among others, which clearly demonstrate their commitment to sports. They were young men, and for them, this was likely an opportunity for personal development. In any case, returning to the subject, sporting events played a vital role for the SS garrison. For instance, official celebrations were held in June for the summer solstice, with a strong emphasis on physical activity. The warm weather allowed for almost any sport to be practiced then. Games, including soccer and handball, were organized between teams from different camps, as well as between civilians and SS men. These events also provided an opportunity for other members of the SS personnel, and sometimes the town's residents, to participate and watch the matches. In fact, the guard companies frequently assigned their men to fill the stands as spectators. So clearly, sports served as another major form of entertainment. Then there were the camaraderie evenings, Kameradschaftsabende. These social gatherings were organized by Department 6 for the entire SS garrison, or at other times for specific groups, officers, for example. SS men were often welcome to bring their wives or fiancées, making these events highly effective for fostering social cohesion. A band composed of SS men from the guard companies typically provided the music. It was, in fact, a very traditional military event with food, alcohol, and conversation. Even during the war, extensive efforts were made to maintain a social life for the personnel here. Another form of entertainment for the SS, organized by Department 6 or the Commandant's office, involved the camp's prisoner orchestra. According to accounts from numerous survivors, the band was forced to play at various picnics and social gatherings hosted by the SS, where the inmates could observe the perpetrators in more private, candid moments. So the camp orchestra was also used to organize the garrison's leisure time. As I mentioned earlier, trips to Weinrieb, to the SS Zollehütte retreat, were arranged as well. Personnel could sign up for these getaways or simply be granted time off for rest and relaxation. Notices were posted detailing the sign-up deadlines and the designated contact person. These group excursions traveled by a special bus that took everyone directly to Weinrieb, usually for the weekend, and brought them back afterward. Lodging and meals were provided on site. There was even a prisoner work detail assigned to serve the SS men staying there. Much of what we know about how time was spent at Zollehütte comes from Karl Höcke's photograph album. He documented practically the entire visit, capturing exactly what their leisure time looked like and the activities available to them. At times, SS personnel were sent to Zollehütte for what could be described as field training. This primarily applied to members of the guard companies, who were able to rest there while undergoing training, a shift from their usual camp routine. Essentially, the retreat functioned as a spa of sorts. SS men with health problems could be assigned there, or to other sanatoriums for recovery. We know these situations occurred based on surviving documentation. Anniversaries and holidays were also a major part of garrison life. National Socialist holidays, such as Adolf Hitler's birthday or Wehrmacht Day, were celebrated in Auschwitz with considerable solemnity. These evenings often involved entire families and had a distinctly family-oriented feel. For instance, during the Wehrmacht Day celebrations in March, children could go on carriage rides. The administration went to great lengths to ensure that personnel and their loved ones could spend their free time just as they would have during peacetime, as people in the Reich did. Holidays introduced by National Socialism also played a vital role. Take the summer solstice mentioned earlier, or Julefest, a pagan Nordic celebration intended to replace Christmas, held just before the traditional winter holiday. Julefest was organized both for the Auschwitz garrison and their families. A few days later, a special event for children followed, complete with gift-giving, making it a true family occasion. We can actually see what this ceremony looked like, including the ritual of lighting candles on the Christmas tree, in Karl Höcke's album, where the author himself is captured doing just that. This was quite an important element of the entire event, which concluded with a festive dinner. Such moments clearly demonstrate how the Third Reich's new, pseudo-religious life was tightly orchestrated by the authorities. These major events were strictly planned and monitored by the Commandant's office and by Department 6. Naturally, there were occasions when the SS men organized their own leisure time, particularly when they were on leave or granted passes. Tracking their activities during these periods is far more challenging, as very few documents have survived. Ironically, we mostly know about what they should not have been doing, because reports of their misconduct reached the commandant and resulted in disciplinary action. A fairly well-known incident occurred at a hotel in Sosnowitz, when several members of the Auschwitz garrison started a brawl with Wehrmacht soldiers. Because they were later forced to explain themselves, the entire clash is documented in detail, from who took part to what triggered it. This case serves as a prime example of how some spent their free time, even if their actions were far from approved by their superiors. While on leave, SS men interacted with outsiders. We know that sometimes they would openly talk about what was going on in the camp, particularly regarding the final solution. This was forbidden and severely punished, as was bringing women into unauthorized areas, especially while intoxicated. There were designated venues for meeting civilians in one's free time, but some SS men still broke the rules, perhaps to impress their dates by taking them, for example, to canteens strictly reserved for members of the garrison. We also have information about brothels in the town of Auschwitz. They did not all operate at the same time, as the establishments changed over the years. The Third Reich authorities strictly regulated which ones the SS men could visit and which were off limits. What else could they do in their spare time on their own initiative? Well, bird watching was one option. We also know that Lachmann from the political department collected stamps and traded them with his colleagues. Other SS men enjoyed fishing, which was not always permitted, or swimming in the Sowa, despite being banned from certain areas. Cycling trips, outings into town, family visits, and travel back to the Reich or their respective hometowns, all of these were standard pastimes of the period. Additionally, many Volksdeutsche from the camp garrison traveled to the Balkans on leave. It is difficult to say exactly what they did in their leisure hours. However, we can assume their private activities were very similar to the official ones. We also know what they were forbidden from doing, yet did anyway, thanks to extant records on punishments, such as those for returning late from leave. For instance, one surviving document details the search for an SS man who failed to return from his leave. When investigators searched his locker, they discovered he had been corresponding with several young women. These letters provided a clue as to where he might be hiding. Although desertion was initially suspected, the matter was eventually cleared up when he was tracked down. It turned out he had simply decided to extend his stay. Naturally, he was punished accordingly, and today we have a documented example of such an incident. The camp authorities wanted to monitor the garrison's leisure activities for several reasons. First, as military units operating under strict discipline, the SS men never truly experienced complete freedom during their off-duty hours. Second, the National Socialist ideology, which demanded total control, dictated that personal time be spent only on activities that were officially approved and ideologically acceptable. Finally, the war itself inevitably limited the scope of these pastimes. If we look at the calendar of cultural life in Auschwitz, it becomes clear that it was surprisingly rich, at least until 1944, when the shifting situation on the fronts brought a major change in both the quality and quantity of these events. Prior to that, though, they had been quite frequent. It is also worth noting that the common rooms were remarkably well equipped, giving the SS men plenty of choices for their free time. Of course, in a period without television or the internet, activities like listening to the radio, reading books, playing board games, or practicing sports were the main forms of entertainment. The recreational options provided to the Auschwitz garrison were exceptionally diverse and stood at a much higher level than those available to ordinary citizens in the Third Reich. While civilians had to cope with numerous wartime hardships, such as bans on dance events and restricted access to cultural and sporting activities, the SS men faced no such deprivations. Ultimately, their cultural life was fairly extensive, and the program offered by Kurt Knittel, or earlier by the Commandant's Office Garrison Sergeant Major, was quite compelling. To sum up, this juxtaposition may seem jarring. We see the SS men attending operetta evenings or watching light comedy plays, and then the same individuals participating in the mass murder taking place in the nearby gas chambers. It is a very striking contrast. Yet, we must remember that the camp authorities were deeply invested in maintaining high morale and protecting the psychological well-being of their personnel, as duty in Auschwitz was by no means easy for them. The point here is not to justify their actions, but to explain why there was a need for such intensive recreation, and why it mostly consisted of light-hearted entertainment or physical activities. In any case, their leisure time stood in stark, chilling opposition to their daily work. Nevertheless, we cannot overlook the fact that these were simply human beings who even here in Auschwitz tried to lead a normal life, a fundamentally human trait. While this realization may be obvious to researchers, it can seem strange and almost unbelievable to those who do not study this history on a regular basis. Yet it is precisely why we need to discuss it. Doing so provides a deeper insight into camp life, a better comprehension of history, and vital lessons for our own future. It reminds us that perpetrators are not some killing machines operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They can be ordinary people who go fishing together or go to the theater. I hope this episode offers that perspective and provides some food for thought.
I mam nadzieję, że to też można wyciągnąć z tej mojej historii i też przemyśleć to sobie.
All episodes of the On Auschwitz podcast are available at auschwitz.org/podcasts. We kindly ask you to support our mission and share our podcast in social media.